Hello, All Stars. It's me, Mrs. Elkins. Welcome back to another week of I Survived the Grizzly Attacks. This week, I'm going to read chapters 12 through 16. So I hope you enjoy. And remember, this is an AR book, so listen up and take notes. Chapter 12. I grew up about 100 miles north of here in Canada. My dad and I used to spend lots of time in the woods. One day, when I was 13, my dad and I were heading to our favorite fishing spot. We came around a corner and surprised a sow and her cubs. A sow was a mother bear. Mel's stomach clenched. She knew what was coming. Mel had heard gruesome stories over the years of hikers slashed and bitten and left half dead by mother grizzlies. The sow went after my father first, just slammed him with her paw. Father went down so hard it was like he'd been struck by a sledgehammer. When he fell, he cracked his head on a rock. Steve took a breath. Then the grizzly turned to me. Cassie's hand crept over and was now gripping Mel's. They both stopped eating. Steve explained that there's no way to know for sure what a grizzly will do when it sees a person. It's extremely rare for a grizzly to attack a person, he said. It might make a noise, growl, and woof. It might stand up to get a better look, or it might do a bluff charge. What's that? Mel asked. It's when a bear comes running at you, but it stops short, maybe 20 feet away. It's just trying to scare you. I bet that works, Aunt Cassie said with a nervous laugh. That's when most people would run away, which is a huge mistake. You should just never, ever try to run from a grizzly. Unless maybe there's a tree nearby. But even then, it's risky because some grizzlies will climb. So, what should a person do if they think a grizzly's going to attack? Aunt Cassie asked. Drop down and play dead, Steve said. That's what I did. The grizzly came charging toward me, and I could tell she wasn't bluffing. How? Mel asked. She was silent. Her ears were pinned back. She wasn't trying to put on a noisy show to scare me. She saw me as a threat to her cubs, and she was going to eliminate that threat. So I dropped down onto my stomach and glued myself to the ground. I clasped my hands behind my neck to protect it. The grizzly slashed my back with her claws. I was lucky I had my pack on, because it protected my spine from her bites. Mel cringed. I stayed perfectly still and quiet as she bit and clawed at me. I dug my toes into the dirt so she couldn't flip me. I didn't want her to slash my face or crush my chest. The whole thing was over in less than a minute. When I finally got up, she and the cubs were gone. I was in pretty bad shape. The worst was my leg. She sliced it open with her claw. He pointed at the scar. And my dad? It wasn't the bear that killed him. It was the rock he hit when he fell. Oh, Steve, Cassie said. But there was something else. Something worse than losing my father. Men from town went into the woods. They shot the sow and her cubs. That's the last thing my father would have ever wanted. He loved the wild. He wanted to protect grizzlies. He would have understood that the grizzly was protecting her cubs. There were tracks everywhere. We should have known to stay away. My dad shouldn't have died that day, and those bears shouldn't have died either. I'm so sorry I asked you about that, Mel said. Don't say that, Steve said, reaching over and patting Mel's hand. I didn't have to tell you, but it's good for me to talk about it sometimes. It's never good to keep sadness all bottled up. They all sat there quietly for a moment, and then Steve stood up. He shook his head as if he was waking up from a dream. All right, he said. We've got about a mile left to go. They put their trash into packs and set out on the trail. Here there, bear. Hey there, bear. Hey there, bear, Steve called out. Mel looked around, wondering who or what was listening. Chapter 13. The last half mile of the hike was torture, a trudge up a steep hill. Mel was sure they'd never get to the top, but suddenly there it was just ahead. The Granite Park Chalet. Beautiful, Aunt Cassie exclaimed. The stone and log building looked like a fairy tale cottage, only maybe a little bigger. It sat up on a rocky hill. All around were grassy slopes dotted with wild flowers and a few small pine trees. They staggered into the lobby, a big airy room with a rough stone floor and walls made of logs. All around them, exhausted but happy looking hikers were lounging in big chairs. Welcome, said a burly man from behind the front desk. He introduced himself as Greg. He was the manager of the chalet. He offered them cold glasses of grape Kool-Aid and directed them to their rooms upstairs. Steve was in a small room on his own. Mel and Cassie were next door. Their room was barely big enough for the metal bunk bed that was pushed against the wall, but it was bright and clean. Mel yanked off her painful boots and peeled away her filthy, bloody socks. Those poor toes, Aunt Cassie said, looking at Mel's bubbling blisters. Good thing my feet are numb, Mel said with a pained laugh. Tough girl, Cassie said. Mel slipped on her red flip-flops and peered out the window. In the distance was a jagged row of mountains. The slopes were still white with snow. It never melted up there, even in the summer. Aunt Cassie came up behind her. That's Heaven's Peak, she said, wrapping her arm around Mel. I know, Mel said. Mom had told her all about it. She could almost imagine that it was Mom standing there with her. Suddenly, Mel felt that cracking apart pain in her heart. She felt the flood of tears coming. She wiggled out from under Cassie's arm. Be right back, Mel said. I need to go to the outhouse. She rushed downstairs and went outside. She found a chair in the corner of the big front porch. She just needed to be by herself for a few minutes, to pull herself together. But seconds later, three noisy and sweaty men collapsed down in the chairs right next to her. Whew! Exclaimed the man with a bushy mustache. That hike was a killer. I think my feet are going to fall off, said a skinny man with no hair. You won't be sorry you came here, said the mustache man. Not after tonight. Mel bent down to scratch a mosquito bite. I don't get it, third man said. How do they get the grizzlies to come every night? Mel froze. She eyed the men. I told you, the mustache man said. They dump all the leftover food into a big ditch. It's out back, down the hill. And every night the grizzlies come. You can stand right on the back porch and watch them. Sounds like a good show, said the no-hair man. Wait till you see, the mustache man gushed. If we're lucky, we'll see a fight. Last time I was here, there were two huge beasts, and they were fighting over something. I don't know, a ham bone, I think. And they just started going at it. Wham, wham. The man smashed his fist into his open hand. The bigger one was clobbering the little guy. I thought it was going to rip his head off. His friends whooped and slapped their legs. Mel fumed. She wanted to tell the men how disgusting it was to watch grizzlies fight over a bone. She didn't have the guts. She got up and ran inside. She found Steve and Cassie standing in the lobby looking worried. There you are, Cassie called to her. Mel rushed to them, nearly knocking over a rickety table stacked with old magazines. You were right, she said breathlessly, looking at Steve. Something terrible is happening here. She swallowed hard. They're feeding grizzlies garbage. What? Aunt Cassie said. Mel filled them in on what the men had said. Then she looked around at the people in the lobby. Was that why they'd all hiked 8 miles to get here for the grizzly show? Steve looked crushed. Those were the rumors I had heard, he said. His gentle eyes were suddenly flashing with anger and disgust. I was hoping it was just some crazy story. Cassie was fuming too. We have to do something to stop this, she said. Suddenly, Mel had an idea. You can do something, she said to Cassie. She grabbed a magazine from the stack on the table and held it up. You can write an article. Millions of people read Cassie's articles. Last year, she wrote about a company that was dumping dangerous chemicals into a river in Montana. After the story came out, the president of the company was arrested. Now, he was in jail. She's right, Cassie, Steve said. If more people knew what was happening in Glacier, things could change. Cassie seemed to disappear into her thoughts. Her eyes grew steely. "All right," Cassie said finally, "I'll do it, but I need help." "I'll share my research," Steve said, "and I'll do whatever you need me to," Mel said. "Good," said Cassie said. "Now we're going to learn as much as we can about what's happening here and how they're getting away with it. We'll hike back tomorrow morning and I'll start writing. I'll call some editors and hopefully we can get this story out quickly." Mel's heart was pounding. Cassie would make sure the whole world found out the truth about Glacier. Then things would have to change. Mel just hoped that it wasn't too late. Chapter 14. "So tell me, Greg," Cassie said, looking sweetly at the manager who'd greeted them earlier that afternoon, "when exactly do these grizzlies show up here?" Mel and Steve stood behind her with painted-on smiles. They were pretending to be all excited to see the grizzlies eating from the dump. If Greg knew how they really felt, he might not be truthful with them. Mel felt like a spy. "Oh, the grizzlies come every single night," Greg said, neatening a stack of papers on his desk. "They'll be here when it gets dark. We'll make an announcement." "We've been hearing all about it," Steve said lightly. "I'm surprised the Rangers haven't put a stop to it and, ruined everything." "Because isn't feeding wild animals supposed to be against the rules at Glacier?" Mel asked. "Of course it was. There were signs everywhere. 'Do not feed the animals.'" "Oh, the Rangers know all about it," Greg said. "There were 3 Rangers here just a few nights ago. They were out there watching when the bears came. Didn't say a word to me. And besides, they know we have no choice." "About what?" Steve asked. "We have to dump our garbage out there because what else are we going to do with it? The Park Service gave me an incinerator back in June so we could burn our trash, but it was way too small. The thing broke after a few weeks. I kept asking for a new one, but they just ignored me." "So the Park Service knows all about this?" Steve asked, a little too loudly. Mel gave him a nudge. She didn't want Greg to get suspicious, but Greg didn't seem to notice. "Sure they know. This has been going on at the chalet for years. The tourists love it, and the Rangers know that. I'm just keeping up the tradition." They thanked Greg and went outside. They were barely out the door when Steve started to rant. He was seething with anger. "Did you hear that guy? Doesn't he know how dangerous this is? They're hurting the bears. They're going to get someone killed. The Park Service knows? This is crazy." Mel's own cheeks were burning too. How could he not realize how wrong this is? Cassie shushed them. "We have to stay calm. We have more work to do." She looked around. "It's time to find that dump." The dump was right where the mustache man had said it was, in the back of the chalet down the steep rocky hill. The big ditch was filled with bottles and cardboard boxes and cartons. The stink of rotting food rose up. It reminded Mel of the disgusting smell of old Slim's breath when he stuck his head through the window. The sight of the garbage made Mel queasy. So she looked down at the dirt instead and saw something else. "Look," she said. The dirt was covered with paw prints. They were everywhere. Steve knelt down. "Grizzly." He studied an especially huge one. It was twice the size of his hand. "See how the toes are lined up straight," he said, his finger hovering over the print. "That's how you tell a grizzly print from a black bear's. A black bear's toes are curved, like an upside-down U. And look here." He pointed to the 5 dots running across the very top of the print. "These indents are the tips of the claws." "How many bears have been here?" Aunt Cassie asked. "It's hard to tell without really studying the prints," Steve said. He peered around, then walked about 10 yards to the side. "But it looks like at least 5 different adults and some cubs." They hiked down the grassy hill near the bottom. There was a small cooking grill and a fire pit. A sign said Granite Park Campground. They all stood there in shock. "They actually let people camp out here?" Mel asked, even though the answer was clear. "The grizzlies have to pass right through here on their way to that dump," Steve said. "This just gets crazier and crazier," Cassie muttered, shaking her head. Thinking about it made Mel's skin prickle with fear. A creeping uneasiness filled her chest. Granite Park was in the middle of nowhere. The closest road or ranger station was miles away, and Mel knew there were no phones up here in back country. If something happened, if someone got hurt, it would take a very long time for help to arrive. Chapter 15. Later that night. The sun dropped down behind the mountains and the sky turned bright purple. They'd changed out of their sweaty clothes and were now in the dining room eating dinner. The sounds of happy chatter and clinking silverware rang out around them, but the mood at their table was grim. Mel picked at her food, at her bowl of beef stew. She pictured it sitting in the dump, covered in flies. They talked quietly about what they'd learned that day and who Cassie was planning to call once they got back to the cabin. I'm pretty sure National Geographic is going to want the story, she said. Mel could tell she was itching to get started. Pops had an old typewriter in the cabin for writing letters. Cassie figured she could have the article finished within a few days, but then it would be at least 2 months before it was published. Maybe more. Mel wished she could press a button and instantly send this story to people all over the world. But this was real life in 1967, not some science fiction story set 1,000 years from now. The dining room was buzzing with excitement. There were about 30 people here, including a family with little kids. They'd overheard Greg talking about the even bigger crowd that would be there over the weekend. Every room is booked, he said. We'll have people out in the campground, too. How many of those people were coming to see grizzlies eat garbage? Mel didn't want to know. Thinking about it made her nauseous. Dinner was winding down. The waitress brought them all fat slices of chocolate cake, but none of them took a bite. A woman at the next table stood up. It's time for our sing-along, she exclaimed. People clapped and cheered. Steve turned to a man at the next table. What's happening? It's a Granite Park tradition, the man said. Every night after dinner, there's a sing-along. Cassie groaned. Oh, I have a voice like a screeching parrot. Steve chuckled. I bet you it's better than mine. The woman started to sing, and everyone quickly joined in. Row, row, row your boat. That song. The last time Mel had heard it was that night in the car, the night of the accident. Mel broke out in a cold sweat. Her heart started to pound. She felt as if cold hands were gripping her throat. Everything around disappeared. Her mind seemed to snap. I, I'll be right back, Mel stammered, pushing herself back from the table and hurrying away. She rushed out the door and into the night. She wasn't thinking. She could barely see. She had no idea where she was going. She sprinted wildly through the darkness. She ran until the sound of blood pounding in her ears was louder than the singing voices in her head. She collapsed into the grass, buried her face in her hands, and let the tears come pouring out. Slowly the spinning stopped. Mel sat for a minute, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She felt dazed, like she'd woken up from a nightmare. She remembered hearing that song, how the room started to spin. This wasn't the first time this had happened to her, that her panic had sent her on a wild sprint when something reminded her of the car accident. Once at school, a teacher walked by and Mel caught a whiff of her spicy perfume, the same perfume Mom always wore. Next thing Mel knew, she was a quarter mile from school in the middle of a park. She had no idea how long she'd been there. Another time, she was at the supermarket with Dad and heard an ambulance scream by. It sounded like the ambulance had taken Mom away after the crash. That time Mel wound up a block away, sitting on a curb behind a bakery. It always took a few minutes for Mel's mind to really clear, and now she realized she better figure out where she was. Steve and Cassie must be looking everywhere for her. She was just standing up when she heard something, a low, gut-twisting growl. Grrr. Mel froze and then slowly looked around. Suddenly she knew exactly where this blind dash had taken her. She was at the back of the chalet, just a few yards away from the garbage dump, and just ahead, glowing in the moonlight, was an enormous grizzly. Chapter 16. Mel wasn't the only one who saw the grizzly. From somewhere behind her, back up the hill, Mel heard voices and clapping. "There's a grizzly!" a man shouted. "The show's about to start." Flashlight beams lit up the bear, which was about 20 feet in front of Mel. Its eyes glowed green in the lights, and those eyes were drilling right into Mel. She didn't move. She didn't breathe or blink. Stay calm, stay calm, stay calm. She just had to walk away, get back to the chalet, like she had the other night at the cabin. But something about this grizzly kept Mel's feet glued to the ground. It was coming toward her without making a sound. Its ears were pinned back. It was acting just like the sow that had attacked Steve, and Mel knew in her bones that this grizzly wasn't going to just let her back away. It saw her as a threat to its food. That ditch was right behind her. The air smelled of garbage mixed with fresh food. The workers had probably already dumped some of tonight's leftovers, the bait, to get the grizzlies to come for the show. The cheers and whoops were getting louder. People obviously had no idea Mel was down there. Their flashlights were pointed at the bear. The beams danced around, stabbing at the grizzly's eyes. She had no doubt the lights were making the grizzly even more furious. "Stop!" Mel wanted to scream, but she was afraid to make a sound. Her only hope was to drop down and play dead. She prayed the attack would be quick. She realized she had no pack strapped to her back, no thick hiking boots, nothing to protect her but her light t-shirt and shorts. She thought of the scar on Steve's leg. She had only seconds to decide what to do. Play dead, she told herself. But then she noticed a pine tree in front of a big bush. She knew that grizzlies could climb, but most didn't. Should she risk it? Before Mel knew what she was doing, she had kicked off her flip-flops and was sprinting towards the tree. The bear was just a few feet behind Mel, launched herself upwards. She gripped a low branch, kicked her legs up, and swung them around. Too late. The grizzly was right there. With lightning speed, it rose up and swiped at Mel with its paw. Its claws stabbed into her thigh, ripping open her flesh. Mel gasped at the pain, but she managed to pull herself higher before the bear could knock her down another swipe. Now the grizzly was even more enraged. The frail tree shook as the grizzly pounded against it with its paws. Garr! Suddenly a man shouted, "Wait, there's a girl in the tree!" The cheering and clapping stopped. It became eerily silent. All Mel could hear was the bear's low, hissing breaths. A woman shouted, "We need to help her!" And then, crack! The branch snapped and Mel fell into the darkness. I hope that you enjoyed today's readings, chapters 12 through 16. Next week, I will finish the book and then I'll give you the code to take the AR test if you would like that. And in the meantime, go take a break, get some wiggles out, and have a great day of learning. See you next week.